Today's material is a structured lecture exploring the psychological mechanisms, tactics, and impacts of silent manipulation, along with actionable strategies for victims to recognize and counter it.
And I have to say, it establishes a remarkably strong foundation right out of the gate.
Oh, absolutely. Grounding the behavioral analysis in solid physiological concepts like Gottman's flooding and the anterior cingulate cortex pain pathways, it just really validates the visceral experience of the target.
It really does. It's a great start.
Yeah, for sure. So let's jump straight into our first area for refinement.
The current framework establishes a stark binary between manipulative silence and healthy boundary setting, which risks oversimplifying the complex reality of trauma-induced communication breakdowns.
Right, so let's look closely at the section discussing the defining characteristics of silent manipulation and the physiological flooding piece.
Yeah, that section stood out to me too.
Right. Now, the text frames the lack of communication largely as this calculated, conscious choice to withhold. And honestly, it's like treating a software bug the same as a hardware failure.
Oh, I like that analogy. How do you mean?
Well, if you've got a software glitch, say a system overwhelmed by too many background processes, which is essentially what emotional flooding is, you can just reboot it.
Right, you just restart the machine.
Exactly. But if you have a hardware failure, like a burnt-out motherboard, which is more akin to a fundamental lack of empathy or a conscious desire to punish, rebooting does nothing.
Because the machine itself is actually broken.
Right, the screen goes blank either way, so it looks the same on the surface. But the root cause and the necessary fix are completely different.
That hardware versus software analogy captures the dilemma perfectly. And this is where the draft really shows a weakness, I think.
How so?
Well, it assumes that a person's intent, whether they are consciously trying to control the victim or simply trying to survive a moment of overwhelming stress, is just easily identifiable from the outside.
I see. Like the victim can just read their mind.
Exactly. The material leaves a massive gap regarding individuals whose trauma responses perfectly mimic manipulation.
Like what kind of responses?
Think about things like extreme avoidant attachment or dissociative freezing. In those moments, the silence is undeniably destructive to the relationship.
Sure, the impact is still very real.
Yes, but the conscious intent to punish or, dominate or exert power it's entirely absent. Their prefrontal cortex, which is that logical, planning part of the brain, has essentially just shut down.
Wow, so they aren't plotting. They're actually paralyzed.
Right. They are physically incapable of engaging in that moment.
Early in the manuscript, the author brings up the anterior cingulate cortex, which I just found fascinating.
Oh yeah, the pain pathway research?
Exactly.
For those not deep into the neuroscience of it, that is the exact same region of the brain that processes physical pain. So to the brain, being given the silent treatment literally registers as a physical blow.
It's wild to think about. A broken arm and a broken heart light up the exact same way on an fMRI scan. It really is. So, from the target's perspective, the ostracism feels identical whether their partner is maliciously plotting or completely trauma-frozen.
Which is why the author has to handle this carefully.
Right, and that makes me want to push back a little here. If we introduce a gray area into the text, aren't we just giving victims a convenient loophole to excuse their abuser?
That's a really valid concern.
Like they might read this and think, oh, they aren't manipulating me, they're just dealing with a trauma response. How does the author balance this without invalidating the victim's very real pain?
That is the exact danger here, and it's a brilliant point. We absolutely cannot read a lecture that accidentally encourages victims to endlessly psychoanalyze and excuse their abusers.
Right, because that just keeps them trapped.
Exactly. So my suggestion here is to introduce a spectrum of silence rather than maintaining this rigid binary. But, and this is key, tether it strictly to observable behaviors rather than mind reading.
Okay, so focusing on what they actually do.
Yes, we need to acknowledge the messy middle ground of reactive self-preservation, but give the reader concrete tools to tell the difference.
I like that. We move away from asking, what are they thinking, to what are they doing? How does that actually look on the page, though?
I'd implement this through a couple of specific additions. First, in the Defining Silent Manipulations section, the author should add a dedicated paragraph that explicitly discusses emotional paralysis.
So painting a picture of what that freeze state looks like.
Exactly. Describe a scenario where someone is so overwhelmed by anxiety or A triggered trauma response? That they desperately want to reply to a message, or they want to speak up in the living room, but they physically can't formulate the words.
Like their throat just closes up.
Right. That establishes the software glitch for the reader.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about your second edition?
Second, and this directly addresses your concern about giving abusers a loophole, the author needs to clarify the recognition signs section. You distinguish malicious stonewalling from severe trauma freezing by observing the person's behavior after the fact.
Ah, okay. So looking at the aftermath.
Yes. Once the conflict has passed and their nervous system has finally regulated, what do they do? A conscious manipulator will refuse accountability.
They'll just act like the silence never happened.
Exactly. Or worse, they'll blame the victim for causing it.
Right. Classic gaslighting.
But a trauma survivor who is in a genuine free state, however, will often feel immense remorse. They will be open to clinical support or therapy once the threat has passed. The willingness to repair after the storm is the diagnostic tool.
Oh, that nuance is crucial. It really elevates the material from a simple list of bad behaviors into, a truly clinical, accurate diagnostic tool.
Yeah, it gives the victim clarity without relying on assumptions.
And it honors the complexity of the human nervous system without leaving the victim stranded.
Exactly.
And logically, once we equip the victim to recognize that they are dealing with malicious silence, rather than a trauma response, they naturally try to break that silence. They speak up.
Which usually doesn't go well.
Right. Which leaves us to a whole new set of problems. The material makes a strong case for the insidious nature of this behavior by highlighting how silent manipulators fly under the radar compared to loud manipulators.
They definitely do. It's an invisible kind of abuse.
But I find myself wondering about the audience to this dynamic. Like, if someone is quietly shutting down their partner or colleague, how do the people around them respond?
Well, that brings us to the second point. The analysis of silent manipulation's impact heavily isolates the one-on-one dynamic, overlooking the broader environmental factors that often enable and shield this behavior.
Yeah, it's the vacuum effect.
Exactly.
I mean, the text does a thorough job detailing the target's internal isolation, and it briefly mentions triangulation, but it treats the relationship as if it exists in a sealed-off environment, just two people in an empty room.
Precisely. The weakness here is that it failed to address how bystander culture, family systems, or institutional norms actively reward silent manipulators and simultaneously invalidate the victim.
Wait, reward them? How so?
Well, society generally prefers the illusion of peace over the messy reality of conflict resolution. People don't like tension.
Oh, so this silence is actually preferred by the group.
Yes. When the lecturer ignores the ecosystem surrounding the relationship, it misses a crucial layer of why the victim feels so deeply gaslit. The silent manipulator doesn't just weaponize their own silence, they weaponize the environment's preference for silence.
Wow, that is such a profound concept.
It really changes how you look at the whole dynamic.
It does, because the person who eventually reacts to the silence, like the person who raises their voice, who demands a resolution, who shows visible frustration because they are just starved for communication, is the one who gets penalized by the group.
Exactly. The target becomes the problem, simply because they are making noise.
But let me challenge the mechanics of that for a second. Is it really the environment actively shielding the manipulator, or is it just the environment, not noticing the invisible abuse?
Oh, the environment usually notices the tension, but it fundamentally misinterprets a dynamic because of its own biases.
What kind of biases?
Well, people see one person yelling or crying and one person sitting quietly, and they just automatically assume the loud person is the aggressor.
Oh, I see. Because the quiet one looks calm.
Right. So the suggestion to resolve this is to expand the lens of the lecture to include the ecosystem that allows silent manipulation to thrive. We need to show how the manipulator leverages outside perceptions to maintain their control and escape accountability.
Okay, so if I'm the author, I'm thinking, great, I agree it's an ecosystem problem, but I'm writing a lecture on a one-on-one dynamic. How do I actually put this on the page without writing a whole separate chapter about sociology?
That's a fair question. You don't want to derail the whole piece.
Right. So what are some specific ways to integrate this?
You do it by threading the environment directly into the existing examples. Take the workplace version, bullet point, for instance.
Okay.
Right now, it probably just describes a boss ignoring an employee. Just a basic one-on-one stonewalling example.
Pretty standard.
Yeah, but you can expand that to explicitly detail how corporate HR environments often mischaracterize the stonewalling as, quote, maintaining professionalism,
Oh, wow.
or they frame it as refusing to engage in office drama. You can explain how this corporate bias inadvertently punishes the victim who is actively trying to vocally resolve an operational issue.
That makes so much sense. Because the victim is pushing for a resolution, they look disruptive.
Exactly. The victim is branded as hysterical, emotional, or, difficult to work with, while the silent manipulator is literally praised by HR for being calm and collected.
Wow. That is a deeply resonant point for anyone who has experienced workplace bullying.
It happens all the time.
The silence is institutionalized. The company policy itself becomes the abuser's shield.
It really does. And you can apply this exact same environmental lens to personal relationships as well.
How would that work in the family dynamic?
Well, in the triangulation section, the author should mention the role of family enablers. Add a brief discussion about how extended family members often excuse the silent person with enabling phrases.
Like what? Like, oh, they're just shy.
Yeah. Or things like, that's just how they are. Don't take it personally. Just leave them alone. Explain how this compounds the victim's cognitive dissonance.
Because now it's not just the abuser telling them they're wrong, it's the whole family.
Exactly. The family system is essentially demanding that the victim accept emotional starvation in order to keep the broader family peace.
Gosh, it forces the victim to choose between enduring the abuse or being completely ostracized by the entire family unit.
It's a terrible position to be in.
It really is. And by bringing the environment into the equation, the material validates a secondary and arguably more insidious level of the victim's trauma, the institutional and social betrayal.
Exactly. It's not just that your partner is ignoring you, it's that your mother-in-law is telling you you're crazy for being upset about it.
Right. So the victim is isolated by the abuser, and they are isolated by the environment.
It's a complete trap.
Naturally, as we move toward the climax of the lecture, the material transitions into strategies for the victim to fight back.
Which is the most important part.
Yeah. And as I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that the listener should utilize specific counter strategies, eventually pointing to the final antidote of using Gottman's 20-minute repair attempts to navigate these conflicts.
Yeah, that's what the draft currently suggests.
But looking at how severe this abuse actually is, especially with the institutional shielding we just talked about, this section raises a massive red flag for me.
It does for me too. The introduction of Gottman's repair attempts in the final section inadvertently risks shifting the burden of conflict resolution onto the target of the manipulation.
I want to really unpack the mechanics of this, because Dr. John Gottman's research is universally respected in relationship psychology.
Oh, for sure. It is the gold standard.
Right. For anyone unfamiliar, Gottman found that during an argument, if a person's heart rate climbs above 100 beats per minute, they are physiologically flooded. Cortisol is dumping into the bloodstream, the fight-or-flight system takes over, and rational communication is it's impossible.
Your brain is basically in survival mode.
Exactly. And his solution is the 20-minute break. You call a timeout, you separate, you let the heart rate drop, and then you mutually return to repair the issue.
Which is brilliant advice for couples therapy.
Right. So why is it a trap here in this specific context?
The weakness lies entirely in the contextual placement. By placing Gottman's 20-minute break advice immediately after discussing chronic, abusive silent manipulation, the text conflates mutual relationship distress with unilateral emotional abuse.
Oh, I see. It treats them as if they are the same problem.
Exactly. Gottman's interventions are designed for two willing participants who are mutually invested in repairing the relationship, but who are simply flooded by stress hormones.
Right. It's for partners who actually want to fix things.
Yes. So asking a victim of deliberate, punitive, silent manipulation to initiate a structured, healthy repair attempt is ineffective and, frankly, potentially dangerous.
Let's go back to our earlier analogy. If it's a software glitch-like emotional flooding, you can reboot the system with Gottman's 20-minute break.
Right, the system restarts fine.
But if it's a hardware failure, a genuine desire to punish, rebooting does nothing. We're essentially telling the victim to try and reprogram a broken hard drive.
That's exactly what it is.
And if the anterior cingulate cortex is lighting up like a broken bone from this silent treatment, how can we ask the injured party to set the splint themselves?
You can't. You just can't ask them to do that. And worse, it gives the victim a tool that the abuser will simply weaponize.
Wait, how would they weaponize the timeout?
Well, think about it. If the victim says, okay, I'm feeling flooded, let's take a 20-minute break and come back, the malicious manipulator will simply ignore the 20-minute time limit.
Oh, of course. They won't come back.
Right. They will use the victim's attempt at healthy communication to basically reset the punishment clock. They'll extend the silence to 20 hours or, 20 days.
Wow. Thereby causing even further harm to the target.
Exactly.
It's the difference between navigating a shared misunderstanding and trying to negotiate with someone who is actively trying to dismantle your psychological safety.
Yes. If you hand a cooperative tool to an uncooperative partner, the tool just becomes another weapon.
That is perfectly stated. But Gottman's research is incredibly valuable. Like we said, are we saying the author should just scrap it entirely from the lecture?
No, not at all. The suggestion here is to draw a hard structural line between conflict management tools meant for healthy relationships experiencing flooding and self-protection protocols required for abusive dynamics.
Okay, so keeping the tools but separating their applications.
Exactly. The text must not blur the line between a mutual communication breakdown and unilateral coercion. The reader needs to clearly see which tool belongs to which scenario.
I get the theory, but structurally, I'm a bit lost on how to implement it. Like, if Gottman's advice is right there at the end of the lecture, it's naturally going to be the last thing the reader remembers and tries to apply.
That's a good point about the pacing.
Right? So how does the author format this distinction so the listener doesn't mistakenly apply healthy advice to a toxic situation?
It requires a strict formatting change in the manuscript. If I were editing this, I'd restructure the ending into two distinct, clearly labeled subheadings.
Like physically breaking the text apart?
Yes. Title the first one something like Navigating Emotional Flooding in Healthy Relationships. That is where Gottman's mutual 20-minute rule applies.
Okay.
Under that heading, you can safely detail the 100 beats per minute science, the stress hormones, and the mutual agreement to return, because the context is explicitly defined as healthy.
Got it. And the second heading?
Then create a second entirely separate heading titled Setting Boundaries Against True Silent Manipulation.
And under that second heading, the posture of the advice has to change completely.
Completely. We are no longer trying to fix the relationship. We are trying to protect the victim.
Right. So what does that advice actually look like?
In that boundary section, change the advice from seeking mutual repair to focusing strictly on unilateral self-protection.
Give me an example of how that reads.
For instance, instruct the victim to state their boundary once, leave the room, and explicitly tell them not to attempt to orchestrate a timeline for the manipulator's return.
Because orchestrating the return is taking on the burden of repair.
Exactly right. The advice should be something like, state your boundary, remove yourself from the act of harm, and focus on self-soothing independently.
You don't ask the manipulator to come back in 20 minutes.
No, you don't manage their emotions for them. This removes the burden of repair from the victim and places the responsibility for the manipulator's behavior squarely back where it belongs, on the manipulator.
That is such a powerful distinction. It gives the victim their agency back without making them responsible for fixing the abuse.
Exactly. It's a subtle structural shift, but it makes a massive psychological difference for the reader.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an incredibly insightful breakdown. So, to wrap this up, let's recap the three main takeaways from the critique today. First, replacing that rigid binary of intent with a spectrum of silence.
Right. The material has to account for trauma-induced communication breakdowns, like that dissociative freezing we talked about, just to ensure clinical accuracy.
Exactly. And second, expanding the scope of the lecture to include systemic and environmental enablers.
Yeah, addressing how bystander culture, corporate HR biases, and, family systems often reward silent manipulation. That really validates the broader social isolation the victim experiences.
Absolutely. And the third point is structurally separating mutual conflict repair tactics from unilateral boundary setting.
Because we have to ensure the victim is not burdened with repairing a deliberately abusive dynamic.
Right. So to actually implement these changes, you can take a few actionable steps. Like add a paragraph on emotional paralysis to your definitions section to explain the freeze response.
And definitely address those corporate culture norms and family enablers directly within your tactics examples.
Yes. And finally, split your conclusion into two distinct headings. That draws a hard line between Gottman's 20-minute rule for healthy relationships and unilateral self-protection boundaries for toxic ones.
We highly encourage you to apply these structural and thematic changes to your lecture. It's a great piece, but these tweaks will really elevate it.
Absolutely. Once you've revised the manuscript, we warmly invite you to submit it back to the critique. We would love to review the updated version and continue helping you refine this vital educational material.